Howdy, all you delicious people. The Karate Kid Part 3. We're wrapping up this original Daniel franchise of sorts. Daniel Russo franchise until ultimately we go into the reviews of which that I've already done of Cobra Kai. Because ultimately there's stuff in between that, but ultimately I'm sure eventually Cobra Kai will get to that. Because recently they've gotten already to the Karate Kid Part 2, so eventually they're going to have to probably get to the Karate Kid Part 3, and then ultimately they're going to have to get to what? The story of Hilary Swank, and also they'll have to get into the Jaden Smith story, and then ultimately after that they're going to just run out of story, because they're going to have to just reinvent the Karate Kid within Netflix, I guess, is what they're gonna have to do. They're just gonna have to they're gonna have Daniel as just an old mentor to some young kid, and they're gonna have to do this all over again. I guess would be the ultimate way of doing a complete soft reboot or whatever with this whole thing. Um, I don't know. But anyways, so when going into these movies, no matter how good and or bad that I said any number of them are, I still enjoy them. It's just there's little things here and there that I saw or little things that I ultimately was just kind of yeah, that kind of felt a little goofy or that kind of felt a little clunky or whatever. But ultimately I really like the additions in this movie. I think the additions made this movie feel like it is a much bigger scale, and so I could appreciate that the additions of this seemingly pulling off this high end sequel of sorts. Um, Reasonably, I thought I kind of got it really annoyed with them needing to have you have it to where in every single one of these sequel movies you have to tell us the entire story of the other films, the lead up to this. And I'm like, gosh dang it, man. Dude, this kind of sucks watching this movie, all these movies kind of back to back. Because, I'm reminded of every single thing of The Karate Kid, or The Karate Kid Part 2, and The Karate Kid Part 3 lead up to just tell us where we're going in this movie. Um, there were some slight things that I did have problems with in this movie. It feels like there wasn't uh, it doesn't feel like there was enough story in this movie, and then also they kind of cheapened the tournament. They kind of cheapened the karate tournament in this movie. It felt really I was man, the first film, we really long winded this tournament out where Daniel had to fight many of people. But in this one, it's just kind of nah. They don't go into that route. It kind of seems very flimsy how it's just oh well, everything is really important until we actually get to the one thing that ultimately we have spent so much time talking about, and that part is just really quite rushed through to me, honestly. But anyways, I still thought this movie was good. I still ultimately thought that this movie was good enough to finish off whatever this Daniel series was. Here's the thing, though. Bizarrely, we ultimately have it to where Daniel is ultimately trying to get in shape for this film, I guess. We're having him Daniel be running around with his new girl Jessica. The story of him getting with Jessica feels very really flimsy in this movie. But if anything, there's a lot of stuff where it's just kind of okay, well, like I guess Daniel like ultimately trying to train and ultimately eventually just ending up with Jessica and trying to train with her. I don't know. It seems that like the interesting things are that we never really get like a real like conclusion of every single relationship that Daniel has. He just kind of goes from woman to woman to woman because something just doesn't quite work out. And like funny enough, like you would think it would be severely like very hard for like we didn't have like Facebooks and Instagrams and whatever to like eventually just kind of tell somebody like, hey, like this is the crap that's gone down. Most of the time, you'd probably get like a letter or something. Anyways, I don't know. I thought that this movie was good. It was just like I definitely think that reasonably like both Terry and Mike Barnes's character kind of really saved this film and really kind of like their characters are such good quality and they have such a good approach to this movie that you just tend to like overlook everything else because really they're really the driving force of this film. Ultimately, you actually get Miyagi to actually get a little fight into this film, and I really liked that. Whereas Daniel, like to me, he's just kind of just he's honestly just kind of there through most of the film. Um, and he's the main character, bizarrely. Anyways, so I think that's all I have to say about this film. We have, interestingly enough, we get kind of like the aftermath of mainly Karate Kid 1. Like, this is kind of like the aftermath of the first Karate Kid, rather than like even really talking about Karate Kid Part 2, because ultimately they ultimately went to Japan, and like, what could you do with that? When you have when you have Daniel eventually coming back to the states, it's like, well, like the story has to retie back into the first film again, and so ultimately that's what they do with this movie. So, yeah, like I think it's a very strong finish is what I could ultimately say. No matter how flimsy everything approaches and whatever that this movie goes into, it's a strong finish. It's a really strong finish, and so I can appreciate for that. Like I ultimately like the whole visuals and culture of Karate Kid Part Two, um, but now uh, I like the whole trickery of this story. I like the whole trickery. I like the whole just interesting kind of concept. So let's ultimately go out of our way to just spoil this movie, talk about it, and finish it up. So, anyways, yeah, there's nothing like that ultimately I could much say about it in non-spoiler terms. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time I'm going to spoil this movie. So you ultimately have it to where Daniel is the champion. He's the champion of the land, and so ultimately now he has to defend his championship. And so ultimately the whole thing is for Daniel just like, hey, yeah, like I think I want to defend my championship. Like I worked really hard to get this championship, and now I want to defend it. And you have to where Mr. Miyagi's like, no, like if anything, you don't need to fight again. Like you have nothing to prove to anybody. Like if anything, like you only fight to you only fight for defending yourself, and there's no one that is ultimately hound dogging you in this movie until we ultimately have John Kreese, who's ultimately just a homeless man, just kind of meanderly, just kind of has uh, just gone on a walkabout, just kind of like beside himself. Ultimately, going to the Cobra Kai dojo, seeing a bunch of bills that ultimately he can't pay. because everybody in Cobra Kai had left because John Kreese ultimately disgraced himself by ultimately choking out one of his own students, so on and so forth. So we ultimately have John Kreese, who ultimately calls up Terry Silver, and ultimately just like, hey man, I need some help. And to ultimately we find out that Terry Silver, ultimately Thomas Ian Griffith, hey, we almost have the same similar last name. Almost. Anyways, so Kreese ultimately calls up Terry Silver, and ultimately Terry Silver is a very rich guy, and ultimately Terry and Kreese had spent some time in Vietnam, and so immediately I'm just like, well, is this how they're gonna go with Cobra Kai season 4? Like have Terry Silver come in, and then ultimately probably have uh, Mike Barnes come in for some reason. Justifiably, I don't think Mike Barnes will actually 100% make 100% sense to me. But ultimately, I think like it would be great to have him back into Cobra Kai. Justifiably, I just don't quite understand why have him in the show. Like it'll be great to have him in the show. Like I'm sure Sean Cannon is amazingly still in great shape. It's just like I can't justify why not just get someone else. Because ultimately you're gonna need a younger person to combat the younger uh, Cobra Kai, Eagle, Fang, and whoever heck else kids. Ultimately, spoilers maybe a tiny bit for Cobra Kai season 3. But anyways, um, we have it to where Terry Silver is ultimately this rich guy who ultimately is sending Kreese on seemingly a Cobra Kai franchise buying. Because ultimately Terry's like, yeah, I bought like 5 to 6 other like Cobra Kai dojos for you. Like, oh, go ahead and check all those out. Because ultimately Terry is otherwise tied to Kreese via Vietnam, and so yeah, like that's the easy like ultimately we have Terry who owes Kreese one, and so reasonably we have it to where Terry is just going to try and figure his way in to Daniel and ultimately try to manipulate Daniel. Ultimately to tell Daniel that he's like, hey, like I just wanted to let you guys know. Like ultimately Terry Silver uh ends up finding Daniel, and ultimately he ends up finding Miyagi, and ultimately he's like telling him, it's like, yeah, just letting you know, like that John Kreese ultimately had just kind of he disgraced the Cobra Kai name, and ultimately he was John Kreese was trying to make amends, and he otherwise just died of a heart attack. And so ultimately, I'm coming in here to ultimately put everything right, and ultimately, I'm hoping that ultimately we can kind of just let the past be the past, and ultimately work forward, and blah 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 blah. So we ultimately have Mr. Miyagi that is telling Terry Silver, it's like, well, hey, I'm sorry for your loss, and ultimately, it seems that repetitiously we have just Terry Silver going like maniacal laughter. It's like and then leaving. And then ultimately, like Daniel is like, did he just maniacally laugh? And Miyagi's like, shush. No one needs to know he's maniacally laughing. But anyways, so we have to ultimately we have the contract, which ultimately Daniel needs to sign to be in the karate tournament. And again, Mr. Miyagi's like, dude, you don't need to do the tournament. There's no reason to do it. Like, you're not fighting Johnny Lawrence. He's not coming back from the grave to come back from the skeleton costume wearing dead and come after you. Like, so there's no reason for you to fight. And so reasonably, Terry Silver has to come up with a reason for ultimately LaRusso to fight. Because ultimately, Terry is just evidently buying every single book of karate magazines, I guess. And ultimately, there is a bad boy of fighting that ultimately is Mike Barnes' character on the cover of one of the magazines. I'm like, wait a minute. One, how is there a karate magazine? And two, why is it that they're like, I'm so confused. Like, why would there be like magazine? Like, I guess there just has to be an easy way to easily pick out this guy. You would have thought that like Terry Silver would have just kind of went and had people scout like certain karate dojos and found Mike Barnes or something, or I don't know, any number of things. The guy could have been doing some interviews. Anyways, it doesn't matter. So you ultimately have it to where Mike Barnes is ultimately just repetitiously pushing LaRusso to ultimately, of course, sign the contract, and like to the point to where it seems like they're breaking into Daniel's house, or in case in point, Miyagi's plant place that ultimately he's taking care of bonsais. Technically, it's Daniel's, and technically, it's Miyagi's, because ultimately, Daniel ultimately put up the money for this bonsai restoration, and Miyagi said, it's like, well, hey, like, we're going to be partners in this. Like, you're going to get 50% of the profits and this and that, because ultimately, like, we're in this together. So we have it to where, Mike, with his lackeys, are ultimately just telling, like, LaRusso, like, dude, sign the contract, and ultimately Daniel's like, no, like, I'm not gonna fight you, like, no, like, ultimately, like, we have it consistently where Daniel keeps refusing, and ultimately Mike and his lackeys end up doing some work on, like, stealing everything from Danny to the point where they, like, steal all the plants, and this just goes over and over and over until eventually we have it to where Danny is kind of like, you know what? Like, I'm feeling like I want to train again, but Miyagi's just like, well, I'm not going to train you. To the point where Daniel just gets frustrated, and so Daniel just goes right to Terry Silver. Because ultimately we have it to where Terry keeps bumping into him on purpose, and ultimately just talking about, like, hey man, have you ever heard of any sweep techniques? Like, I'll get you a book. Or ultimately he, like, shows up at the dance that evidently Daniel and Jessica are at, and ultimately he ultimately pushes some guy to fight Daniel, but that happens a little bit down the road. But yeah, we ultimately have it to where Terry ends up giving Daniel a sweep technique book, and ultimately Mike ends up, like, kind of walking in to try to get to Daniel, and ultimately Terry comes in there and tries to stop him. And then ultimately we have it to where, like, hey, look, like, the funny thing that, like, Terry does is he takes his book, and ultimately he hits Mike with it, which I thought was kind of hilarious. Then ultimately Mike gets kind of like pushed off to where, like, well, if Daniel wasn't strong enough, then Terry was to ultimately take him down. And so Mike kind of just fluffs off. And then we have it to where, uh, like, Terry gives Daniel this book, but then eventually he tells him, it's like, well, there's not much that you could really do from a book. It's like, well, what was the point of the book then? To where like Terry like starts trying to like show Daniel how to sweep a leg, and so ultimately like you can kind of see that like Daniel is not strong enough to really sweep Terry's leg, to where ultimately Terry is just kind of like doing a little trip over to make Daniel look good, and ultimately like Terry's like, "Oh man, you're really strong, kid. You're really strong." Yeah, sure. God, that guy is too big for Daniel to just sweep the. There's like, especially with like that kind of like it looked kind of flimsy, but whatever. Um, so ultimately we have it to where Terry is just like, hey, well, if you want to train with me, like if ultimately Miyagi is just kind of like soft serving you, and you're not really kind of sure like if he's gonna help you or not, like I'm more than willing to just kind of show you the ropes anytime there, buddy. So we again have it to where Terry's walking away and and Daniel's like, again, aren't you doing that maniacal laugh over there? And ultimately Miyagi's like, shh, no one needs to know. Still. Again. Shishola, Daniel. So we push on, and ultimately, we have to where eventually Daniel is ultimately going and training with Terry Silver, and it's consistent that ultimately, like, Terry wants Daniel to hit this wooden dummy and, like, hit it really hard, to where ultimately, we have it to where Daniel's hand just starts to bleed his own blood, and to where Terry's like, yeah, but that's his blood, not yours. That's the dummy's blood, not yours. I'm like, no, that's Daniel's blood, just so you know. Um, because ultimately, at first, like Daniel doesn't hit the dummy strong enough, and ultimately he he's starting to kind of get hurt from the dummy, and then Terry's like, God, I'm wasting my time. Like, God, I thought I thought I was gonna train a champion here, but I guess I'm just wasting my time training you. Like, I need to leave, and then ultimately you just hear like Terry again maniacally laughing in the background, and Daniel's just like, well, I didn't hear that maniacal laugh this time, so I'm just gonna keep starting to hit this wooden dummy, and hurt myself. As Terry's laughing away, cackling in sorts in his own way. Um, so we have to where eventually Mike keeps popping up, and so eventually we have it to where Terry Silver is ultimately giving this dummy a face, ultimately reminding Daniel that it's like, well, hey, this wooden dummy is Mike. You need to take down Mike. He's been giving you so much crap lately. You need to take him out. And so that's when ultimately we have Daniel that ultimately just starts beating the living crap out of this wooden dummy, to where he's like breaking all the boards and everything like that. And Terry's like, yeah! Like, you did it, Daniel. To where ultimately we have to where Daniel's like, oh my God, I can't believe I did all of these things. Like, I can't believe that I broke the pieces of this wooden dummy. But because ultimately we see Terry doing it, so ultimately Daniel eventually does it. And so eventually we have it to where Daniel is giving, or Terry is giving Daniel these weird sayings. Like, if a man can't see, a man can't fight. If a man can't love, then a man can't fight. No, like it's all these like weird, bizarre sayings where it's like a man can't see, a man can't fight. If a man can't, uh, like if a man like it's all these weird sayings. Like I don't remember all of them. I probably only remember the last one. Uh, but like you have it to where Daniel has to like at first. I think the first one is like if a man can't stand, a man can't fight, and then ultimately. I think the second one is if a man can't breathe, the man can't fight. So ultimately, you have Daniel that ultimately has to like punch the guy in the chest to ultimately kind of knock the wind out of him, I guess. So I guess that's I think all of the other sayings that ultimately Daniel ultimately gets into doing. So we ultimately push on to ultimately have Daniel going to this dance and ultimately ending up just out of muscle memory, you have it to where Daniel ultimately punches a guy in the nose and breaks his nose, and you ultimately have Terry and Daniel because ultimately Terry's at this dance that they're at. Ultimately, Terry and Daniel runs off, and Terry is so proud of him because like, dude, you just punched that guy in the nose without thinking. Like, yeah, like I'm proud of you because now like you're just gonna do all kinds of stuff because ultimately I've manipulated you so well. What did you say about manipulation, Mister Silver? Oh no, you didn't hear that part, Daniel. You didn't hear that part. But the audience did. Anyways, moving on. So we ultimately have it to where, but Daniel is feeling so terrible about punching that guy in the nose that ultimately he goes to the hospital or he calls the hospital to figure out where this guy is so that way he could say that he's sorry. He's ultimately realizing what Mr. Silver is doing and he's really just starting to hate it. Like he's really just realizing that even Mr. Miyagi felt like Danny was cheating on him with Terry Silver and he was just kind of like, you know what? How about we train? How about we how about we do like some karate sessions? And then Daniel was ultimately just like, well, I'm gonna be busy. I'm gonna be seeing a friend. I'm gonna go and with Terry maniacally laughing off somewhere. I'll see you later. I'm cheating on you, Mr. Miyagi. Hope you feel bad about it, cause you will. Cause you will. So we push on, and so ultimately we have it to where Daniel is realizing what he's doing is wrong, and ultimately Miyagi is the one there to ultimately be like, you know what, like, yeah, like there is crap that's going wrong. It's ultimately just consistently pushing to get Daniel to do this tournament and everything like that, because ultimately uh, we have to where eventually like all the plants are taken. Ultimately, Daniel eventually has to go to the one plant that is ultimately going to be seemingly going to make Mr. Miyagi a lot of money. Daniel ends up getting this plant and ultimately gets forwarded by Mike and his goons again. Ultimately, you have Daniel and Jessica who are ultimately trying to get this plant together. They're on ropes, and so ultimately, like the Mike and his goons are just kind of stalling them from getting this plant back up. Eventually, they break the plant, and ultimately, like there's a whole kerfuffle, but it ends up where Daniel finally signs the contract. Ultimately, to where we have it to where eventually now Danny is ultimately going to confront Terry Silver and just be like, you know what? I think the training with you is over. And to ultimately we have the huzzah moment where we realistically have Daniel and Mr. Miyagi both going to this dojo. We ultimately have Terry Silver, who is ultimately going, aha, like I got you. Like we swerved you. I manipulated you. Ha ha ha. Because ultimately, Mike ultimately shows up at this dojo to confront Daniel a little bit, to just kind of poke at him. And then we ultimately have John Kreese that ultimately appears, and he ultimately has his goofy looking face of, ha ha ha. Like this weird looking face that he has. Um, and to ultimately we have it to where Daniel doesn't exactly really fight anybody. We just have Miyagi who just fights seemingly like all three: Terry, Silver, John Kreese, and Mike Barnes. He just all takes them out. Where just kind of Daniel is just kind of just there. Um, Ultimately dunking some paint on Terry Silver, which I thought was kind of funny. But yeah, like we have to where easily Miyagi just takes out all of these guys like one by one, because they all like slowly but surely, like they don't come at him like it's not like three versus one. No, like they slowly come at him, and some Mr. Miyagi eventually slowly but surely takes all of them out. So, excuse me, we have a tour pushing on to the tournament. So, oh, I ultimately didn't mention. Jessica ultimately was a girl that was fused in this story because ultimately we have it to where Jessica was a pottery maker for, I guess, the plants of which that Mr. Miyagi and Daniel had, and so ultimately Daniel was going to Jessica's pot making place to ultimately go over designs of what the bonsai tree logo was supposed to look like, and so eventually seems that this girl is seemingly like she has no Patrick Swayze to do pots with. So ultimately, Daniel is like, "Well, I could maybe be your Patrick Swayze," and so ultimately, Jessica's like, "You know what? Maybe you could be," and so we eventually have to where like Daniel is going over designs. Sure, he is with Jessica on a date, and so they're going out on a date, and that goes all full good and well, um, and this and that, and ultimately, yeah, they eventually have a relationship that is probably already seemingly not really going to go anywhere already because you kind of have Jessica that is kind of cementing. It's like, well, I already have a boyfriend, but maybe there's something about you that is just gonna just change all of that, and I'm gonna marry you, and we're gonna be together forever, or probably not, because ultimately Cobra Kai. But yeah, like that whole like Jessica was ultimately just saying like, well, I don't know if this is gonna be a really long stretch of relationship. Cause ultimately, I just like I already have some guy like Daniel is just the guy off to the side. It's like, well, you could be my Mister right now, but I ultimately have another guy that's my forever. So ultimately, I'm assuming that Jessica is probably going to be what? Is she going to be probably in Cobra Kai eventually to ultimately showcase that like she was one of Daniel's loves, but eventually she went on to marry that guy, and that is the closure moment that everyone needs, bizarrely. Anyways, because we've already had all of the other love interests that Daniel have had and lost at some point, uh, kind of barely giving closure to how he lost all of them, quasi. Um, but anyways, spoilers probably still for Cobra Kai season 2. If you haven't seen the seasons of Cobra Kai and you're now here talking to me about all this stuff, I'm sorry. Go into watching any of those seasons and then ultimately like it's all on Netflix right now. It's easy. So I'm sorry if I'm probably bringing up anything from any of the Cobra Kai shows. I tried to really in the first The other thing, I try to like avoid talking about it, or make jokes about like it happening eventually somewhere down the road. But anyways, we have it to where ultimately, let's get to the tournament. Let's finish this up. So we ultimately have it to where really Barnes is fighting people, Mike is fighting people, and Daniel just kind of shows up and just like, yeah, I guess I'll just be like, meh, I'll just be like fighting Barnes and that's it. So ultimately, like, we ultimately have Daniel as uh, the defending champion, and so we ultimately have Mike, who's kind of fought a lot of people and already tired, I guess. So we ultimately have Daniel, who's fresh from off of not having to train at all in this movie. To me, like, I don't think he really like. It kind of feels like we had a much more trained uh LaRusso in all the other films, whereas in this one it's just kind of like, yeah, I've done this so many times now. I'm like, nah, I'll just do the same things that I did in the other films. Just kind of what happens in here. Um, we ultimately have Mike whipping all kinds of tail, and then ultimately we have LaRusso, who is just kind of like, yeah, here's my one fight that I have to do. Because ultimately we forget about doing tournaments in this entire movie. So we ultimately have the fight between Mike and LaRusso, and the best thing about this is that Terry Silver is whispering sweet nothings to Mike, to ultimately tell him it's like, hey, make the match close. Ultimately, if you get a point, take the point away, and just like, we want pain, we want punishment, and everything. Like, we want Daniel to just be in the 7 levels of hell or whatever. So we ultimately have this match out, and so I really loved Mike in this fight, where ultimately he's just kind of like, he's kind of he's kind of giving Daniel some crap. Like, I like it how like we have it to where Mike is like punching Daniel, and ultimately Mike is ultimately looking at Terry, and he's like, "Oh no! Like, I hit him in the face." Ugh. And Terry is just like relishing in this, and he's like, "Oh, I like it when he just punches him and just beats him and just." It's like, it's so awesome. So we ultimately have Mike, who is just like, he's like powering through Daniel, and Daniel is just like, whoa, whoa, what's going on? Um, like, we have Mike that is just like having Daniel at like the palm of his hand, really, and like Daniel is getting like suckered into all of this, to where eventually like Daniel gets so much fear going, because he's just like, dude, like, I'm falling into the palm of this guy's hand. Like, I'm afraid. And Miss Miyagi's like, focus. Like, don't be afraid. Like, if anything, like, this is the last movie you're gonna do. So don't be afraid. So we have this match getting really, really close, and ultimately you have Daniel that is bizarrely doing a bunch. Like, we have like his match point, where ultimately we have Mike, who is now like going like, what am I gonna do? Because Daniel is just doing this like all these like kata kind of like movements and stuff like that, to where Mike's like, what is he doing? And ultimately everybody's like, yeah, I think he's lost his mind. Like, I think he's hallucinating. He's gone cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And so we have it to where Terry's like, get the point, you schmuck. And so we have to where Mike is just like, well, I guess I gotta get the point. And then we ultimately have it to where uh, Daniel finally stops his motions, and then hits Mike, and then ultimately gets the point and then wins. ultimately everybody, all the villain side has egg on their face, and ultimately they're just like, what the heck? Like, how did he win? He's so small and not as good a shape as he was in the other movies. How the heck did he still win? And so on and so forth. Like, he didn't do as good as training as years before. What kind of garbage is this? And reasonably, that's just kind of how the movie just ends. There isn't really much of a real true, um, like, real closure ending for the villains. You ultimately just have people that are kind of throwing back the Cobra Kai shirts back at the Cobra Kai members, and you have John Kreese that's ultimately like, "Hey, mother, like throwing your shirt at me? Like, dude, that's gonna be some merchandise gold in years to follow. Like, keep that bad boy." And so ultimately, you have it to where Terry and John are ultimately walking away from all this, like they're trying to wash their hands of it all, but ultimately, like I'm sure Terry Silver is just like, God, how many Cobra Kai dojos did I buy for John? Like, God, what a garbage thing happened here. Like, we have just egg on our face, because good God. So, we ultimately have Daniel winning, and ultimately that's just the conclusion of this movie. Like, the conclusions are not all that good, but I guess they probably figured, well, maybe if we do a fourth one, we'll have the real true conclusion, because that's what happened in Karate Kid 2, was to have the conclusion of one, and so ultimately, like, the conclusion of uh, two going into three was basically realistically not much of anything, with the exclusion of just like talking about uh, Kamiko, who ultimately had just not gone to the States with Daniel and ultimately had done something else, and ultimately Daniel had separated with Kamiko to ultimately open up Jessica in her Patrick Swayze ghost like ways of pottery making. But other than that, yeah, I thought that this movie ultimately was just, it was fun. It was a fun film. I think ultimately, like, realistically, every one of these films, ultimately, if any of them are goofy or have horrible stories or whatever, or kind of clunky stories, every single one of these movies, in conclusion, are all fun films. Even the Hilary Swank movie is a fun film, and so is the Jaden Smith film. It's kind of fun. Um, so recently, if there's anything that I said of like, God, these movies are garbage or blah blah blah, like really every single one of them had the same theme. It's all like, oh, you have to persevere against a bully and everything. That's the real cue of every story. Um, as well as there eventually being a whole entire Cobra Kai series that kind of just carries on to that. But anyways, so yeah, these movies are meant to just be fun, and for that one, that's all I have to say. Is like if I thought they were stupid or I thought they were goofy, like at the end of the day, they were fun. They were fun. They were supposed to just be like, hey, get into karate, do karate after this. But ultimately, like, eh, like I think you now have like mixed martial arts and stuff like that, where it's like you have people having to try several different kind of disciplines, as well as also doing um, like wrestling and stuff like that. So it's just kind of like you now have like mixed martial arts and stuff like that. So, anyways, yeah, that's just me just kind of talking about this film. But I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.